Hello, and welcome to the Joyscape Therapy Podcast, a community for professionals in the field of applied behavior analysis, for board-certified behavior analysts, speech therapists, occupational therapists, parents of children with autism, neurodivergent individuals, and in general, anyone seeking to learn more about ABA or about interacting with individuals with autism or other related diagnoses. Tune in as we dive into episodes discussing perspectives related to shaping behaviors in professional and personal settings, allowing for behavioral principles related to everyday life. Our motto here is everyday behavior for everyday people. A reminder that with listening to our episodes, you can earn 1 CE. Listen here for the code words, then visit our website at www.joyscapetherapy.com/CEUS. You'll enter the code words and your BACB info at checkout, and then receive your certificate in 5 to 7 business days. If you love our content, please follow us on social and Facebook and Instagram at Joyscape Therapy, where you can find fun activities to facilitate play with children, creating interactive teaching opportunities, and other relatable content. I am your host, Marissa McKenzie, and to help me disseminate today's topic, we have my awesome colleague, Samantha Hightower. Sam has featured on 2 previous episodes, episode number 5, Mommying as a BCBA, and episode number 9, Less Restrictive Sleep Training. We are so happy to have you on for our 3rd episode to share some of your insight and experience on today's topic of the importance of sound supervision, strategies to create an effective supervision relationship. How are you doing, Sam?
I'm good. I'm excited to do this again. Talk about something that's not so, it's still personal, but not as personal as the other 2. I'm excited.
Great. We're happy to have you on. So let's start with that. What does sound supervision look like? So there can be many forms, but utilizing sources that we reviewed from building and sustaining meaningful and effective relationships as a supervisor and mentor by LeBlanc, Seller, and Ally. In some, they point out some great essentials, including defining roles, understanding your past and previous experiences as a supervisor and a supervisee, talking about feedback, basing the relationship off of values, and planning for feedback, just to name a few. So based off of your experience, Sam, what does a sound supervision relationship look like to you?
For me personally, I think the main points are leading and teaching your supervisee, how to do something rather than just delegating tasks and assignments, really spending the time with them to teach them, what you're looking for and what things mean, rather than just expecting them to find it out on their own. The biggest part is probably treating the supervisee with respect, and ensuring that they feel comfortable just going to you with any questions. I think one of the most important parts is just being approachable, and letting the supervisee know that you're not going to punish them for possibly making a mistake. In fact, you're going to teach them how to fix it, how to do it correctly. Even if you would have done it differently, that's the whole point of this relationship, is to teach them how to do something. So I think those are probably the main points for me.
Yeah. No, that's a key point too. I think just being approachable, right? I think later in the talk, we'll talk about, approaching it with kindness and compassion. And it is always that balance of understanding how to teach someone to do something, but also put their own twist on it, and also how to make sure that they have enough freedom to add their own touch to it, where we're still, monitoring some things, like competency-based things, but again, really allowing for their own take on things, right? How to approach certain things. So I think that is definitely a key piece that we'll touch on today as well. So a few objectives that we want to make sure we discuss are understanding the importance of sound supervision, what it looks like, how to put it into practice, and address any challenges that might arise. A relationship is one in which each have the opportunity to learn and thrive professionally and interpersonally. So if you're currently accruing field supervision hours, or you're currently signing off on field supervision hours, this episode is definitely for you. So I've personally always been passionate about teaching and coaching. I find value in passing on knowledge that can be helpful and sharing tips where others can benefit. As of late, taking on a leadership role within the agency has me hyper-focused on systems and how to create systems and streamline with what support looks like, right? So LeBlanc et al. Has a great box quotes within their text. One of them is to the extent of a replica is not a goal, but rather that an individual can make it their own and put their own twist on it. It being their oversight of the RBT, their supervisory relationship in general, being a supervisor. So this quote resonates with me because when I see something working well, sometimes in the past, I may have been a little bit more rigid. So changing the recipe, right? But with development, I've been able to open up and understand the many different paths or angles to problem solve. And I love that for myself and for those I work with. But Sam, what is your supervisor, kind of perspectives led you up until this point? What kind of exposure have you had in those areas?
I relate to you too. I think I was actually given a great chance because I had multiple supervisors in the past and who had their own experiences, right? So they kind of had their own style to supervising me, where one was more of the, you got this, just try it and see how it goes type of thing. And at first that terrified me, but then I realized actually this is great. She trusts me. She thinks I can do this. So it gave me a lot of confidence. And then I had others who were a little bit, I think, had a little bit harder of a time letting go of the reins maybe. And, or maybe it was just that they wanted to ensure that things were correct because they didn't want me to mess up a treatment plan, or I don't know, something like that.
Yeah.
But I do think that overall, it's my experience has helped me be less rigid with things. When I program, especially, I don't just stick to an assessment only. I make sure to talk to the clients and their parents about what is actually most important for you and how can I fit that into our programming. I think that sums it up pretty well.
In the past, do you feel because, especially in the model that we have at Joyscape, but supervising multiple different RBTs, I know we've talked about this. And I think it's something when you're talking about supervision, it is important that although we're not currently in that model, I like to think that the skills and the capacity that I've built being with Joyscape will still allow me in the future, whether it be our model goes to that type of model or even at other places, I can still supervise RBT level individuals with quality, right? And also carrying over some of the skills that I've learned just in that example alone, right? Being a little bit more rigid in my beginning years versus learning how to be more flexible and also how to be more approachable. I think that's been a big thing too, is the shift and maybe the break also has given me time to reflect. So I think that's a really big thing. And working with master's level students who are, doing their field work, there's a different type of motivation there too that I think is, notable to at least mention.
Yeah, I agree. I actually had noted here in my notes that in my past, I thoroughly enjoyed working with the master level students and people who were, accruing hours for their BCBA exam because the passion was there. They knew this is what they wanted to do. Whereas I think of myself as when I was an RBT too, and it's I was very not so confident in my skills, and I was still kind of is this what I want to do? Do I want to do counseling instead? I was kind of on the fence at one point. So my whole head wasn't there all the time, you know, and I felt like my heart was always there, but sometimes I was thinking of other things. And so, yeah, I think there is definitely a difference in who you're supervising, but it's like finding that bridge, I guess, to like how to do it the same, supervise the same for each person is challenging, but it's like once you get there, it's like, oh, like I'm a good supervisor, you know, like especially, and I guess what I mean is like for RBTs especially, I don't think that supervisors or maybe they feel less approachable, and or maybe they're too timid, scared to approach their supervisor because they again might be very unconfident or you know and worried that they're going to get in trouble for doing something incorrectly. But yeah, I think that's where the approachable part comes in. It's like, especially to RBTs, that's what I remember is like, do not come off as a mean person. Like they need help and they're trying to do something you ask them to do correctly. That's bottom line, you know?
Yeah. No, totally agree with that. And there's a common saying, right? Like it costs nothing to be kind. So just really taking that in for a few seconds. Kindness in a supervision aspect to me is really being someone's like hype man, you know, complimenting with a specific phrase on something really cool or creative they implemented, and truly, you know, acknowledging their work. I think that those intangible skills, like those interpersonal skills, are super invaluable. Like we really talk about, you know, soft skills. So we're going to bring up a lot of things we've talked about, whether that be compassionate care, soft skills, even being trauma informed, cultural competency. So all of those things really do merge into just as much effort as we put in with those whom we work with or who we serve, right? In terms of our clients or our families, like putting that same effort and care into the future, right? Like the future of our field. So just kind of pointing that out. So based off of sections within the text of LeBlanc, we find the following. So they label kind of 3 sections, one being developing a positive approach to supervising and mentoring, 2, teaching meaningful repertoires, 3, evaluating supervision and building career repertoires. So based off of the sections within the text, I think, you know, it goes to that note, like within some of these sections, entails like how to have a committed and healthy learning context. So they really break down in a few different, they have checklists and guides, but kind of breaking down the commitment and healthy learning context is acknowledging the learning process, right? And being attentive, also known as active listening, recalling on things that the supervisee has shared, welcoming perspectives and diversity, and ongoing communication and feedback. I feel like you'll hear that to some extent, all those things kind of meshed throughout this, you know, discussion, because these are kind of those core, right? How do you facilitate learning? Well, you create a healthy environment that harnesses that, right? That makes it possible to learn. So there's a level of not just doing these things and then checking them off of the list, but actually caring enough to embed them within your approach, whether that be in a mentor-mentee relationship, in a supervising, when we're talking about supervising, just specifying like fieldwork hours sign off, or even like an RBT on sharing a case. So, you know, all of those things putting into perspective, like that learning process. So if we care about the population we serve, inevitably, we must, to some extent, care about the quality of services being carried out to them. So what is the importance of sound supervision? Facilitating delivery of high quality behavioral services for families and clients. It helps to support supervisees with pursuit into a career that is meaningful, ongoing outside of the supervision process. So also really highlighting that piece of outside of the supervision process. There's so many things that we can teach, and that generalization piece can go into outside of work as well. So approaching the supervisory relationship with compassionate care might sound like a supervisor is telling you that she just went through a breakup in her personal life. When you ask her how she's doing, then in turn, you're discussing with her about how a family has requested her off of the case. So this might be, pretty impactful, right? So you really want to be mindful of how you're approaching this situation, especially after the supervisee has shared she's experienced something outside of her life. So just kind of opening this up for conversation, Sam, like, how would we approach this situation? Or also, why does it matter?
I was pretty open with my supervisors about everything going on in my personal. So it's this kind of makes me laugh because I was the person who was oversharing a little bit too much probably about my personal life, mainly because I have a hard time masking my emotions. And I also really trusted my supervisors enough to know that kind of information about me. I went through some like pretty major life events, like getting married and my first pregnancy while I was accruing my hours and sitting for my exam. My mental health was suffering a little bit. So I really owe it to my supervisors and coworkers for giving me that support I needed during those times. But the thing is, I felt like they handled it all really pretty professionally. We never spent too much time talking about my personal life. I usually tried to read the room and reel it in when I noticed that I was talking too much about my own issues. Mm-hmm. And when there was, constructive feedback that they still needed to give me in those moments, I felt like they delivered it well. They made me feel seen for whatever I was just spilling to them. But they still kindly made sure to address, whatever they needed to. I, fortunately never went through the experience of being requested off of a case. I can imagine that it would be hard to hear that from anybody, especially if you feel like you built that rapport with that client.
Yes.
But yeah, I think that's the main point, is just making them feel seen, making the supervisee feel seen and heard. And hey, I'm so sorry that you're going through X, Y, and Z. We do still need to talk about a few things related to to so-and-so, but let's get coffee or let's talk more about anything you need to, that's, I feel like, the approach that my supervisors usually took. And so I try to model that as much as possible. I think we're going to talk about, being human and, first. And I think that's really just how I try to apply that to like everything in life, not just supervision. It's, when I'm speaking to anyone, I just remember like, hey, people are not perfect. Be human first and treat this person with respect. And I think it should apply to any relationship.
Yes. No, 100%. And, I think that especially in this scenario, right? So just to reiterate, so like a supervisee sharing that, she's going through a breakup in her personal life. And in the professional aspect, as a supervisor, we're trying to basically talk to her about a family requesting her off of a case. Maybe it's not a right fit. So I really love this because honestly, like my family didn't always talk about emotions a lot. So what I've observed just throughout these, my professional career and, as I've developed is, sometimes emotions make me a little bit uncomfortable when I'm talking to someone I don't necessarily know. But this also goes into being approachable, like you mentioned, being human first. And I've done a lot of work, I think, on my own, like even in therapy for myself, of like, being more comfortable with someone else's emotions, with my own emotions. So I think a lot of that also goes into just growth as a human. And so you don't have necessarily in this situation have to focus on someone's personal life too much, right? Just like you said, like there's definitely a piece of I hear you and, how can I help, right? I hear you and let's work through this together, right? And that alone, the way we phrase it or the way we deliver, whether it be constructive feedback or, some quote unquote bad news, right? I mean, it doesn't feel good to be requested off of a team, but also sometimes if it's not a right fit, that's okay too. And I want to normalize that piece, but major life shifts can really impact how you're present within your work, right? Like that is relevant. And no matter how good you are at masking that, when stress inevitably occurs, it is going to impact you in one way or another. So even if you're practicing self-care, work-life balance, this takes active effort to keep that balance. So a high quality supervisee working through navigating challenges at work while coping with professional life is the work, right? Like that kind of is our role. And just like you shared, Sam, I'll give my little story time, but back in 2020, my mother had to undergo chemotherapy. As you can imagine, this was a super challenging time in my life. It was pouring out in ways at that time that I didn't even realize that I was struggling. I didn't know how to help myself at that time. And I was just kind of going through the motions, wake up, go to work, do what I need to do. And, there was a lot of worry on my mind and kind of pressure. But the one thing that stands out to me is that those that were higher up than me, those whom were supervising me at that time, they really didn't know how to support me either. They were well aware of what I was going through. And I think there were some ways that it was like leaking into my approach. And I look back on that now as a learning experience and as a motivator to be the exact opposite for someone going through something like that, or even, just like a breakup, right? By showing compassion and genuineness, right? As a supervisor. Sam, so what are your thoughts on how to balance between being compassionate professionally and personally? Like, is there a difference?
I think, I was thinking about this question a lot, actually. I think there is a difference only in terms of like how much you're actually spending talking about those personal issues, because you do have, you do have things you need to discuss and teach this person, but maybe it is important, as important as it was for me, to be seen and heard to this person. And so I think it's kind of like they're so hand in hand, actually, really to me. And I really think, like I said, I think you need to be human first in all relationships. So it's hard for me to kind of see, pick apart how they're very different from each other, I guess.
Yeah. So just transitioning into also having a choice to supervise. If I'm reflecting on my own experience of becoming a supervisor, I was literally, I think I passed the exam in May. I got my new position at a new company as a BCBA in July. And immediately in one of the, onboarding training, it was just like, cool, take this 8-hour supervisor training. And I was like, oh, okay. And boom, you're given, 5 RBTs, 3 assistant supervisors. All right, cool. You did the 8-hour training. Go ahead. Back in the day, you didn't have to, back in the day, meaning 5 years ago, you didn't have to wait a year to supervise others. So I'm really glad, at least on that, for that change, within our board, that you do have to wait a year, because I think it gives you time to acclimate. So just going back to this, I think having the choice to supervise is really important. So integrity and dignity for seasoned BCBAs to choose not to take on additional responsibility of supervising others. The choice for the supervisee to assess compatibility and the style of the supervisor. Is it a good fit? Right. And, in some aspects, what I mean by choice, because I know that it is also part of, building for the future for our field. But I think there's a balance between understanding, okay, what is that person's capacity? Are we leveling out their caseload so that they can support someone else? There's just a lot of logistics that go into really effectively supervising someone, but also giving them some grace and some time, right? Some time to learn how to develop some of these skills, So just kind of posing a question of why, Sam, do you think a seasoned BCBA would decide not to be a supervisor?
I think, honestly, the time is the first thing that came to mind. I think it really depends on the BCBA's caseload. If they have a bigger caseload, they might not have time to spend with the supervisee, especially because, going back to what we were discussing before we started the recording, time management is so important to me. And so if I'm not able to focus, or if a seasoned BCBA is not able to put their full time and energy into those supervision like sessions with their supervisor, and you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it's probably not going to be a great experience for that person. And so, yeah, I think that would be one of the biggest parts. I also think it really like depends on the model. Maybe they don't want to necessarily have RBTs under their wings. You know, maybe like us, we know we have the 2-tier model, so it's a little bit different. But if they have the choice to not, you know, I can see a lot of BCBAs, you know, just passing on the opportunity. But yeah.
I think that's a good point too, right? Again, really balancing like ethically, you know, I think our field, the way it is now, is very much, you know, needing to build for the future, right? Especially at the growth rate that we're seeing, BCBAs, BCABAs, right? Our field is growing at an exponential rate, which is a pro and a con. But there is always, again, I talk about this balance because that's really what it is almost all the time, I feel like, is learning how to set boundaries for yourself, but also not having this like avoidant behavior to taking on a challenge. Because how does this cross over for us? So if we are always kind of turning someone down, not to supervise, then almost all of your like great strengths that you bring to the table, I think there's so much value in being able to really spread that, right? And again, not necessarily to replicate it, but to harness that and pass it on to someone else who's growing and can take that and even elevate it and teach you something. So there is always a balance of, yes, having, you know, 8, 9, 10 supervisees, that's overwhelming. So there are pros and cons, but I think really understanding, like for me, what would be the cons for someone the pros for someone who, you know, is already a BCBA, well-seasoned, and, you know, there's this openness, I think that is really what I'm trying to kind of get out, right? It's like, we can always learn more, and I never want to stop learning. So I think there's always that kind of hunger. And again, I think it is still important to have the choice, right? So, you know, also that goes into setting boundaries and, you know, being able to do that in a healthy way. The reciprocated supervisory relationship. So we're designing and delivering training. We're monitoring and evaluating supervisee performance, through client outcomes, also through other measures, but client outcomes being one of them, and providing guidance on direction, goals, and database decisions. So really evaluating someone's clinical decision-making skills, right? How we do that and how we go about that, you know, can vary. So identifying the roles within the relationship. So instead of saying like, oh, you know, let's meet on this date and time, right? Opening that up, providing choices. Accountability and self-management outside of client outcomes should be discussed. Sharing commitment and making it a positive one. So it has to be a collaborative approach. Think of how our actions impact one another and convey how much we care. And Sam, earlier you were talking about, you know, what supervision might look like. So we also haven't talked yet about telehealth supervision and kind of how, you know, not being able to be there in person might impact. But I'd love to hear, Sam, so you have more experience supervising over telehealth. So if you want to go ahead and take it over to kind of touch on, you know, just things you enjoy about that process or things you've kind of had to work through.
Yeah, I think I'm still learning some things that do and don't work within telehealth. You know, like all of us, we kind of got thrown into it like during COVID, but I fortunately still am able and allowed to do it with with one of my clients. I actually supervise an RBT out of state via telehealth, and it's my first time doing this exact situation, but I honestly love it. I get to you know, be in the comfort of my home, or sometimes work, you know, outside of my home, but still on my computer. I just ensure that my focus and energy is 100% on them, even though I'm staring at a camera on the computer. Like, I try to mimic what it would be like if they were sitting across from me at the table or across from my desk. I had a few experiences in the past as a supervisee where, the person was getting a lot of email. They were busy. They were getting a lot of emails, a lot of notifications, text messages were happening. And it just felt like, okay, you're obviously not you don't have the time for this right now. And so maybe let's reschedule. I had to ask to reschedule an appointment once because I just felt like it wasn't worth both of our while. So I really tried to just do the opposite of that. And again, going back to this theme, just making sure that the supervisee feels seen even through telehealth, that they have my full attention. And also a big part that I've realized is, or that I've noticed through telehealth is just the flexibility of needing to be flexible. So sometimes, unfortunately, there's issues with our internet connection, or sometimes, I don't know, the video didn't get set up properly. I don't know, there could be any technical difficulties, right? So just having to be flexible with that, and also, understanding that if maybe they didn't see my email come through for whatever reason, it's not like there was ill intention there, it was just something that occurred, and it was maybe set us back a day or two, but it's really not that big of a deal. And I also know as a parent that with young kids specifically, I need the flexibility of being the other person on the side of telehealth. So when I'm having, my supervision and then the parent wants to hop in and have a little quick check-in, it's I'm just able to be more flexible with telehealth. And I think, although I think a lot of people may not prefer it, because it is, there are some downsides, obviously, you can't be there in person to model something. You can't be there in person to give that personal connection. There is, I think, a little bit lost in telehealth, but I think we're all still learning because it hasn't really been, it's only been a little over 3 years since we're allowed to do this really. But yeah, I think overall I enjoy it. And I would honestly love to keep doing it this way. I think it's also not just for parents and RBTs, it's also very, convenient for, supervisees who are going between client to client and they just want to have a quick supervision meeting, and if they can hop on their phone on Zoom to do it, that's great. So yeah, I think there's lots of pros to it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'm glad that this has been something that companies have been more flexible with too after the pandemic, because there are so many pros. Of course, there are those cons. I think some of those cons, right? If there is another BCBA on site, if they can be the one to, review the feedback you've discussed in a meeting and then maybe implement in person if there's some, modeling that needs to be done, and things like that. Honestly, with technology today, you have things like video recording, right? If you're talking about a specific intervention, and how to, collect data while you're implementing that intervention, or, whatever it might be. Just treatment fidelity in general. I think there are some things that we can work around and really collaborate. One thing too about telehealth, but also just in general, is I've learned the importance of documentation, and how to really develop systems that work for me and my supervisees, so that we're tracking things that we're discussing. Sometimes I get so excited or so passionate in the conversation, that sometimes I forget to write down some of the details, but they're relevant for when we want to revisit them, so just kind of being able to, identify those roles and really understand and kind of segueing that into what is the benefit for the supervisee in a relationship. So ideally, we want the supervisee to have a competent model of technical skills. We want them to be able to answer questions. We're constantly asked questions, whether that be about our clinical insight, about our to provide clinical rationales for recommendations that we're making, or even just treatment questions, right? Implementation questions during our sessions, and really create learning opportunities and have a safety net. Added qualities include having an effective model of how to approach certain situations, providing a high rate of reinforcement, establishing clear expectations, providing resources, and also helping supervisees know how to navigate those resources and outreach for themselves. And in general, there's opportunities for expanded growth. So over time, the supervisee develops independence, confidence, and competence of higher order skills. Why do I enjoy being a mentor or supervisor? Is that I find improvement or making adjustments so fascinating and almost limitless. So that leads into our first code word for today. It is limitless. So I recall when I was taking AP English in high school, and my teacher pulled me aside after class and asked me about a paper I had written and if I had used Spark Notes to write my paper. Honestly, I was a little bit worried about convincing her that I hadn't, because I didn't. At the time, I actually didn't even know what Spark Notes was. But I was proud of myself that I was able to deliver a product that even had a teacher questioning, like how I was able to develop something, so solid, A quality work. So just to give some backstory, because my family was actually not up to par with some of these things in terms of technology, we didn't have internet in our household until my junior year of high school. Just kind of giving perspective to, I've always really enjoyed like that improvement process. I didn't realize my limits until people were questioning me, or, I love that underdog feeling. So I think as a supervisor, I feel like a cheerleader for my supervisees. I want them to come up on top, and, maybe sometimes people don't think of it like that because it's not like a competition. But I have that competitive nature. I have fun with it. And I want to be the best supervisor that I can be. If I'm in a kind of a role like that, right? Supervisee with a supervisor. I want to take what I can from those relationships and be better. I think I've always just had that. I don't know if it comes from Sam. You also share maybe some of that competitive nature. You've also been in softball and sports too. So I don't know. Is that something you have also experienced to some extent?
I think so. And I think I was kind of laughing as you were saying all that, because I'm thinking at my previous company, we kind of shared this mutual, I guess, yeah, we were all a little bit competitive with each other. I'm talking about all of our all my supervisors, coworkers, because we had something called lead instructors who were RBTs that, were maybe considering becoming a BCBA one day or pursuing their master's, and it was as the next step. And it kind of gave you a little bit of self-satisfaction, when one of your mentee, RBT mentees, made it to a lead role or something,
Yeah.
Not that it was really not that it was my doing that got them to that place. Really, it was really them and the way that they applied everything that they've learned to their sessions and whatnot. But yeah, I do recall kind of joking around with my colleagues, just oh yeah, look at so and so, she's the lead now. It was part of my my job that got her there. And but yeah, I think it's probably, like you said, a little bit of our softball background that makes it.
Yes. So I know, but underlying thing though being, really whatever motivates you to be a good supervisor, or also what is your motivation to stay in a in a relationship as a supervisee, because you want to have takeaways, right? I think that's important. It has to be, like we discussed earlier, a reciprocal relationship. So understanding some of the underlying barriers to why a supervisee might not acknowledge or respond well to feedback. I think, it's important to address some of these ways in which we might navigate conflict, because they happen. To push them off as if conflict will never exist in a relationship, I don't think that's realistic, so kind of just areas of improvement. As Sellers et al. Mentioned, setting clear expectation for how trainees should respond to corrective feedback, conducting ongoing evaluation of the supervisory relationship. So constantly asking, is this working for you? Is there anything we can do differently? Using contingency-based evaluations and tracking outcomes. So getting a little bit more into the technical pieces, right? Directly assessing and teaching professionalism skills. This is huge because, we all come from different backgrounds, and we'll touch on that in the next few slides, some of that cultural competency pieces, but also just understanding we have a different path, a different experience. So when we are engaging in a relationship with somebody, their way of professionalism might be a little bit different, right? And also leave room for growth. If you're talking to year one BCBA Marissa, her professionalism looks a lot different than what we see today, right? That is taking time to build, to understand. You don't know what you don't know. So it does take time to learn these things. And lastly, obtaining feedback on supervisory practices. So again, is this working for you? And if it isn't, are you able to set those boundaries? One of the objectives is to build career repertoire. So those soft skills like communication, teamwork, creativity, adaptability, creative thinking, and conflict management, much more as well. All this go into the job of not just being a BCBA, but I think also just being a professional, right? Let's open up the discussion a little bit to cultural awareness. So Fung et al. In 2016 mentioned that by acknowledging the importance of culture, behavior analysts can help achieve socially meaningful goals, such as reducing disparities in access to services and improving the quality of services for diverse populations in behavioral health systems. So there's so much more value within understanding how someone grew up, what their familial system was, their upbringing, and of course, with respect to how comfortable these people are to sharing those experiences. But again, kind of even bringing back to when my AP English teacher was asking me about that, like, she doesn't know that I don't have access to internet and that I don't know what SparkNotes is. But also, again, there's always going to be people that don't know your story, and so if we're talking to supervisees, how do they build that confidence to navigate a world that, may move in a way that they're not comfortable with, right? And that goes into emotional maturity as well. So Sam, for you, what are some questions that you've been asked or asked in the past as they relate to like a supervisee's cultural stances, or even like their values, right? Their value systems, and how you've kind of embedded that in your supervisory relationship?
Yeah, I like this question. It always brings me back to when I was a lead instructor, and I was very rigid in following program plans, and still learning how to be flexible and adjusting to each client's needs and family's needs. And I remember there was a time where I was teaching a feeding program, how to use utensils, and one of the client's grandmothers was there, and she was feeding the client with her fingers and teaching the client to eat with his hands instead. And the whole time I had enough, I would like to say like common sense to not like push it when that's like they were having bonding time. It was so sweet. I wasn't gonna like interrupt and be like, no, make him use his fork, but yeah. I'm not gonna lie, I did like have a hard time like not like wanting to stop and just like prompt like, hey, could you have him use his fork instead? Because there is a nice way to approach that situation, obviously, but it made me think like, okay, obviously this isn't of great value to this or, you know, like maybe are of high importance, I guess, you know, to this family to make him use his fork. And so fast forward to when I was a supervisor, there was like literally like an exact scenario with my supervisee, and I had to remind them like, oh, you know what, like this is actually part of their culture. They prefer to eat with their hands. The only reason we're working on utensils is because mom and dad did want to teach the skill for when they're like outside of home, you know, when they're at school, maybe and when want to use their fork or something like that, you know. And so I was just very happy that I like lived through that experience, and then I got to kind of teach it to somebody, you know, pass it on to somebody else. And now as you know, now that I have been a supervisor for a little bit now, I always start with those questions. It's just like I start with like the adaptive skills mainly, because I feel like you know, eating, bathing, sleeping, like those main three, like those are going to look different for every family. Like the requirements, I guess, for each of those are going to look different for different families. And I always like to not necessarily like start our conversations with it, but I just like to kind of touch on each of those subjects and make sure that I'm tailoring their treatment plan to what's most of value to that family.
Yeah. And in the seller's text, there's awesome resources in general, but there's one particular, what they label it as an activity of exploring your place of privilege. So this also goes into understanding, you know, whether that be race, gender, culture. So I love opening this conversation up because it isn't super comfortable for everyone, rightfully so, right? But I think how we proceed, you know, matters, right? So especially being on a platform such as on a podcast, it's a bit nerve-wracking, but essentially I know it needs to be talked about because it's relevant, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not. So this activity, I feel like, brings about power imbalances in, again, race, gender, culture, and then helps us explore those further with the supervisee or the supervisor, really by understanding where you are, right? You know, I'm a first generation of mixed race, Hawaiian, Samoan, Mexican, right? Raised by my grandparents. So those are just some of those things, right? Cisgender, that the female, like those are things that matter, you know, and although we don't have to ask them outright, the delivering in this is all pretty flexible, but how do we open up these conversations? You know, where does your supervisee stand? And do you know that? Have you ever asked, other than it makes me uncomfortable to ask those questions, so period blank, it's locked up and that's never going to come out because that's not relevant to supervising. You know, we know that's not true, but, you know, I think that navigating this process isn't always linear. And that's what scares us about it, right? And it also might feel a little bit out of our realm. We're like, oh, I don't want to pry. True. How much of that is my own belief versus the person that I'm supervising, or, you know, whomever, right? So I think that is important to at least just let's plant the seed today, right? And again, if you ever have a chance to look at this activity in the LeBlanc and Sellers book of just exploring your place of privilege, even just doing it by yourself. First, let's get comfortable with that, you know, knowing where you stand. And again, navigating that. Any thoughts on that, Sam?
No, I think you can't see me, but I'm just like nodding my head this whole time. I think it's definitely an uncomfortable, I don't know, maybe I'm more comfortable with it now because I feel like I've gotten more practice with it, but I do remember, like, again, like not that, I guess, yeah, 5 years ago too, I guess we're on the same timeline. I probably would have been I probably was a lot more nervous to have these conversations. And, but I think, just using the tools and resources like you mentioned, and like role playing with your supervisor if you can, it would definitely be beneficial, because the first time you have that conversation, it is scary because you don't want to like offend anybody. And like, what if actually, like, I don't know, what if you phrase it how you don't mean to, and you do happen to offend somebody, you know? So I think, like you mentioned, just utilize those resources and ask someone to role play it with you.
Yeah, yeah. And getting comfortable doesn't mean getting more comfortable with something doesn't mean like just do it sometimes, and
Right.
like it's okay to be corrected, right? That's also part of like the constructive feedback receiving, right? Receiving or even giving some of that feedback, and again, just being curious enough to do your own like research, right? Even if it is just filling out that guide solo. So yeah, I think it's important. So again, going back to LeBlanc's gems in here. So in the text, so there's one that says, teach them to know what they do not know. I love this quote. It's packed with so much great things, so many great things. So critically and honestly evaluate the boundaries of their knowledge and skills, right? And how to be able to solicit support by way of training and supervision, or to professionally decline work that would force them to practice outside of their scope of competence. So to me, this says boundaries, right? The balance between giving up too easily on something, right? Like, oh, period, that's out of my scope. Same thing with the cultural piece. Like, oh, nope, that makes me uncomfortable. That's not my realm. But you're declining growth, right? And sometimes doesn't mean immediately you have to take up every opportunity. But if it's just something that keeps coming up where you have to set up boundaries, really like hone in on that, right? Practice. I think the more we practice these things, the easier they become. So not tapping into creative ways to teach things. These are things that can be declined if we're not really practicing, right? Being able to be creative. Like you mentioned, your supervisor kind of gave you the reins, Sam, and, let you, like, it's okay to mess up, right? But also like, maybe you won't mess up. But understanding where your limits are and how to process that, and making sure that you have someone professionally to go to kind of navigate these things. I think that's also, a big piece. And if things aren't working for you, how do you express that in a way that's still respectful? So much of what we're discussing, I often reflect on my own work on myself in therapy, that the know-how, at least for me, had to come from a safe relationship, that I was vulnerable enough to admit to my weaknesses, quote unquote weaknesses, but also grow into my own strengths and own those just as much as the weaknesses. So first year BCBA Marissa would have struggled to set a boundary. Fifth year Marissa still finds herself in situations struggling to set those boundaries. But the difference between the two is that she's learned to practice boundary setting, and she's learned where she's comfortable and when she has to actively work a bit harder to not put herself in any unnecessary situations that can cause undue stress, right? So this isn't just one and done type of thing. Set a boundary, great, I'm a great boundary setter. No, this is an ongoing process, both professionally and personally. You'll likely have to practice. So Sam, how do we teach competency-based stuff without losing the compassion? So basically, how do we get technical without losing the compassionate, gentle part?
I think making sure that your approach is like conversational, I guess, and not just, okay, this is a list of things that we need to do today. Let's go. Making sure that you're starting your supervision sessions with, like, okay, what's something that came up this week that you want to talk about or discuss, improve on, keeping it along, keeping that vibe, I guess, to your session. Again, just going back to what I said earlier, not just like delegating and tasking.
Yeah. LeBlanc mentions competency-based approach in supervision is as follows. So use a curriculum, so within the scope and content, assess performance, teach content using BST, and monitoring performance. So this is initially and ongoing. I think that's a really big focus too. It's like, just because you do it one time doesn't mean you're great at it, right? Keep on doing it, because there's new things that will pop up, and that is where we get better, right? Fine-tuning, critiquing, at first when you start out, there might be a few different corrections or things we might want to take a deeper look at. But as you get, more seasoned, more comfortable, and learn who you are clinically, I think that's the real, kind of reward, right? It's like you learn, wow, this is really cool. Like I developed this, intervention from scratch, or, I created this goal that's super comprehensive. and is going to help this client build this skill. And, I'm really excited about it. I think that excitement piece is crucial, right? This is that reinforcement we all need. So helpful strategies. Agreed upon conditions and basic expectations, and creating a committed and positive relationship. When we talked about compassion, right? Compassionate care, what does it look like in a supervision relationship? It looks like compromising, inquiring about satisfaction, acknowledging mistakes, being patient and reassuring, and not being too authoritarian. A study conducted by O'Hare in 2012 discussed compassionate care regarding soft skills. And we'll touch on that in a later episode this month for soft skills. But when we apply these in ways we implement compassionate care in our work, we narrow in on a few specifics, like those mentioned, but compromising, inquiring about satisfaction, acknowledging mistakes. So much of this is within the ego too, right? If we can kind of harness our ego and receive and give feedback, we're already making strides towards being a better practitioner. Patience, as we know, is, patience is a virtue. But it can really open up doors in a supervisory relationship because we allow patience to grow. We allow trust to develop, and all those key factors coming into your own as a practitioner. And that leads into our second code word for today as we wind down. Second code word is empower. So the BACB provides an entire ethical code section 4, where responsibility to supervisees and trainees. So this is not something we take lightly, right? So really thinking about a few of the ethical codes that are dedicated to responsibility to supervisors and trainees. To name a few that stand out for me: supervisory competence, volume, documentation, and diversity, all things that we've touched on to some extent today. Some more standouts are monitoring and feedback and delegation of tasks. Sam, you've mentioned this, but also kind of narrowing into that of skills of time management and organization management. Those take time. Those do require coaching and facilitating. Those are part of the supervisory relationship, right? So, how we help supervisees through that. A lot of it too is leaving room to make those mistakes, right? I'm one who does learn from, not necessarily making mistakes, but it's okay to fail, right? Like it's okay to maybe, oh man, there was an easier way to do that. Next time I'll remember that, right? Like that improvement thing that for me is a huge value. But yeah, so as we kind of wrap up, just thinking about like that teamwork makes the dream work. We hear these kind of key words and they cross over into areas within our field, discussing different treatment approaches with families, but these apply in supervisory relationships as well. These interpersonal skills, they leak into collaborating with other professionals, with parents, colleagues in the workplace, outside of work. The list goes on. But the key factor is working together in ways that wield teamwork, a dynamic that welcomes feedback. So again, back to our takeaways for today. To me, it's thinking about the bigger picture, but having attainable goals for yourself as a supervisor and with your supervisee to hit the mark throughout your time together. So 1, developing a positive approach to supervising and mentoring. 2, teaching meaningful repertoires. 3, evaluating supervision and building career repertoires. So knowing how you grow in your leadership skills and ultimately shaping one supervisee or mentee at a time to impact the field in a positive and impactful manner. Sam, if you have anything to add before we hop out, please feel free. It's been a joy having you on today to discuss some of your experiences and your insight about supervision.
Yeah, I think the only thing, not really, I think I've already mentioned it, but just to reiterate, is that I think, I meant to say this earlier, it's like you want to be approachable, you want to be likable too. Like you want, not that you need to be best friends with your mentees and your supervisees, but it's a great feeling for me personally. You know, I have some of my past supervisors still texting me, chatting me on, you know, social media, saying like, "Oh my gosh, I miss you." Like, and it's just like, okay, I know I did a good job. Like, I was not only leading you to where you wanted to go professionally, but like I made you feel like I cared about you enough, you know?
Yes.
So I think that's super important, is just your supervisor, you're also somewhat their support person in this hard job, this hard road that we all have to becoming a BCBA. But yeah, I think what you said was perfect end to it. I think I'm still learning as a supervisor. It's hard to believe I've only been in this role for 5 or something years, but yeah, I'm excited, just like you, to continue to learn how to be better.
Yes. Well said, Sam. So great reminder that this is worth 1 CE. Collect your code words, head over to joyscapetherapy.com/CEUS and follow the instructions to earn your CE certificate. If you love today's content, please follow our podcast and leave us a review. This allows us to continue getting quality content out to you all. And that is concluding our episode today. Thanks so much for tuning in.